So without much further ado, I want to introduce Melanie, who is a faculty in LSI, and Jennifer Jimenez, who is a cancer bio grad student who will be our moderator, and it's completely their show. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Shobha, and thank you for the introduction and for inviting me. I think this is a very interesting topic that we can all learn from. So I thought we would start off by first having Melanie give us an introduction about how she ended up at Michigan, her educational path before arriving here, and anything that you think would be interesting to share.
Okay, great. Thanks for coming on a cold morning. And please just interrupt if you have questions, because it seems awfully formal for a nice little breakfast thing. So yeah, feel free to interrupt. So I came from a family who's never done science before, so I just liked science. So it wasn't like I knew all about how to become a faculty member from the very beginning. But I always liked science, and so as I got into undergraduate work, I decided I was going to be a chemist. And then when I got into physical chemistry, I decided maybe I didn't want to be a chemist so much. I'd rather start looking at more biological things. And I swear, if I was you guys right now, I might not even be in graduate, I might not even made it to graduate school, because now you guys have to have so much experience to get into grad school. I came from an undergraduate institution that didn't have graduate programs. It was a small program. I did just like a little bit of undergraduate research. I don't think I would get in. So you guys should be really proud of yourself already, because I think I already would have been winnowed out. So I went to graduate school at Vanderbilt University, and I thought I was going to be a crystallographer, but I ended up choosing a lab that did yeast genetics. And the reason I did that was because I liked the mentor. And I liked the idea of being able to learn to think like a geneticist. And it was really an uncomfortable experience, not the mentor, but the learning how to be a geneticist experience. But it really helped me, I think, learn how to think about hypothesis-driven research in the context of structural biology, because I've always been interested in structural biology. So then I completely changed fields going into my postdoctoral fellowship. I decided I wanted to learn how to do single particle cryo-electron microscopy. And this is also something at that point, right now it's like a great field to be in. There's lots of jobs, but at that point, almost every person I talked to, all my mentors said this is a really bad decision to do that, because there wasn't these nifty cameras or nice microscopes. It was a really niche field. There was this feeling that you would never get to see anything at high resolution. So you're just going to be kind of regulated to the outposts of structural biology. Luckily, I didn't listen to them, so I decided I really liked the idea of being able to look at things. And so I decided to learn this technique. And so even when I went on to get my first faculty position, it was still kind of a niche technique, but limiting kind of where we could go for jobs. But I just did the very traditional graduate school, postdoc, and then got my first faculty position. I did my training as an assistant professor, and I say training because you never stop learning about how to do this at Vanderbilt. So I worked at Vanderbilt for 10 years. I really loved it there, but about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, there was a position that opened up at Michigan, and they needed someone who was doing cryo-EM, which is what I was doing, and they ended up having a lot of the equipment that I really wanted, and so I couldn't turn that opportunity down. And so a year and a half ago, I moved here and started my lab as an associate professor. So that's kind of my background.
Okay, so now sort of leading into more of the topic of today, which is building and nurturing a strong research team. One of the questions that a lot of you guys asked is how do you identify good and motivated students, and what would you suggest as a best practice for hiring graduate students and postdocs?
Yeah, so every bit of advice that you get for starting your lab, you have to take with a complete grain of salt, because if you look around, everyone does it differently and most people succeed. So there's not one path. And I think if you recognize that fact, that you're going to make tons of mistakes and just accept it. And it's not really mistakes, it's just life, right? It's hard to tell if it's going to be a good fit between a student and a mentor. So for students, what I look for, so I think the first thing, when you start your lab, you have to do some introspection and figure out what kind of style you like. You know, some people really like to be, you know, in the lab every day looking at people's lab notebooks. They like to know every little thing that's going on. Some people don't like to know anything until you like have the paper, and often people are in between. So you really have to figure out what you like. And so it's not really whether the student's motivated per se. It's like, are they motivated to fit into the kind of the environment that you're setting? And so that's why rotations are so important too, because it's not just like, oh, can I make it into this lab? It's more like, am I a fit? And so I look for students that are not afraid to come and talk to me in my office, because I don't like to go chase people, and I don't like people who are afraid to talk to me. And so if a student is not willing to come in and talk to me, then it's probably not a good fit. But for other people, that might be fine, because I just, for me, the thing that sucks every bit of joy out of this job is micromanaging, or like keeping track of when people are coming in or coming out. I just cannot stand it. And sometimes you have to do it as a manager, but I try to avoid. That's what I try to avoid. So my most important thing is the student seems excited to be there on their own, comes and talks to me about their project, comes with ideas about what he or she wants to do, maybe other ideas for other projects, but just not afraid of me, because I just can't handle that. I don't have time to make them not afraid to talk to me. So that's what I look for.
That's a very good point. Actually, so I have a twin sister, and she is also a grad student, and our PI is going to be like more different in terms of like their mentorship styles. So, okay, so another question that also came up pretty frequently is, what are good practices of rewarding and encouraging productivity, and what are the no-nos?
Oh yeah, so of course, every time someone gets a good result, I buy them a computer. No, that's a no-no. So I don't reward people so much, I think, because that sets up a weird dichotomy of just weirdness. That would be weird for me. Because everyone is working on a project. It's not just it's their project, it's their career, right? So, I mean, I guess a reward is when, I send people to meetings. And so if you have something to present in a meeting, you get to go to a meeting. If you don't have something to present, then I can't send you to a meeting. So, but that's not like a doling out favorite kind of thing. It's more of, do you have enough to present? But it is, I guess that is kind of a reward. But I wouldn't, so personally, if I was in a lab where the PI was like doing something like that, I wouldn't want to be in that lab, because it sets up to me, it might work for other people, but for me, it would set up this weird, just this, because you don't know what projects are always going to work, right? Or when they're going to work. And to set up this like kind of like a points, it would feel toddlerish to me, like I was taking care of my kids or something. So I wouldn't like it, but I don't know. Have you ever seen someone give rewards? I've never seen that.
No, I mean, I guess it is more like indirect, just like verbally.
Okay.
When things are going well.
Oh yeah.
Like, yeah, but.
So of course, I get super excited when things are going well.
Yeah.
So someone shows me something on a microscope we haven't seen before. Often I'll almost feel like crying. I'm so excited. And when things are not going well too, I try to be a good PI and not be completely depressing and help. But but if someone's giving like actual physical rewards for a good job, I don't know that would be.
So this is another thing that I think is interesting also as a grad student, especially when you're rotating or joining a new lab. But how do you, I guess, like gauge how productive grad students are being or postdocs? And for example, like how long it should take a student to complete something, like what their ideas is of that versus your ideas.
So the first thing that happens when you're in faculty is you forget how hard it is to do things. So that's why you always have your PI be like, oh, you should be able to do this in a week. It never actually quite works that way. And it's not that your PI is being stupid, they forget. So I think one thing when you're rotating, what you want to look at is kind of a globally, how many papers are people publishing before they graduate? Are people in the lab in the process of preparing a paper? There should be, I mean, unless you were starting in a brand new lab, so like I would actually consider my lab here kind of almost a brand new lab because we kind of had to stop and start. But if the lab's been running for a while, you may want to see, you should probably see a mixture of where projects are. Some getting close to the end, some getting just started. You just kind of want to look at that. And then it really depends on what you're doing. So like for structure biology, sometimes students and postdocs won't really be able to publish until close to the end of their time. And that's not because the science isn't going well, it's just you have to get the structure first. Mm-hmm. And so, but in another lab, you might be able to get papers out like within a year. So you just kind of have to look at the lab. And then, don't look at individual people because everyone's different and the projects are different. So you want to hopefully have like a window of kind of being able to look and see like generally what are people doing.
And then do you have any ways of motivating the people in your lab without micromanaging or feeling like you're being too strict, as you said, that's not your style?
Yeah, I don't think, I try to recruit people to have a lot of self-motivation, and so I will definitely give pep talks, and I will, but nothing like, I don't ever have a plan for that. But if someone shows up into my office distraught, I'm definitely going to help motivate them. But hopefully in a, one part about mentoring and being the head of the lab is that, we're there for science. And so there's going to be times when people aren't going to like you at all. And part of that is going to be because you're being a jerk, that maybe you shouldn't do that. But part of it is actually, you do actually have to sometimes tell people hard truths. So, and that's really uncomfortable and it makes people really angry. And I remember this very much myself, being like just so ticked off at my PhD mentor, I could barely like stand talking to her every once in a while. But she was actually right a lot of times. And so this motivation sometimes is almost a demotivation in a sense. You might go in and be complaining about something in your PI and they say, well, actually, you might actually need to be working a little bit harder right now. And you'll be like, what? I don't want to, I can't, I am working hard. And then, be like, well, this is the time you might need to work really hard, like 80 or 90 hours for a few weeks, or, and you may not like to hear that. Or in my case, when I was a PhD student, I was in a long distance relationship and I just really wanted to be done. And my PhD advisor was like, no, you can't be done until you finish your paper, and I didn't like that, but she was completely right. That 6 months to finish that paper made all the difference in my career. And if I had walked away from that, who knows what would have happened. So, but I didn't like that at all, and I really was angry at her. So, the motivation part can be hard because your advisor is not always there to motivate you, sometimes there to just tell you the facts about what's going on.
Okay, so kind of now veering towards managing your lab and your research team. I know you said you have 11 people in your lab. So how do you establish both collaborations within your lab, so people working on the same or similar projects, and then also reaching out to collaborations outside of your own research group?
So the technique that I use is a technique that a lot of people want to learn and a lot of people want to collaborate with. And so we actually have some honorary members in the lab, my lab, sitting in the audience. So one way that I do this is we can't collaborate with everybody because if I did that, then people in my lab would never get their own work done. So what I try to do is find labs where people want to learn the technique, and then we establish a collaboration where they're pretty much, I just consider them my lab members, even though they're not officially my lab members. So they can hang out in the lab, they're invited to everything, they can meet with me. We try to include them in everything that they want to, but they don't have to do anything because they're really a member of another lab. And then that actually helps the project move quicker because that's actually their project and they really care about it. And so that works well for like a structured biology technique. So that's how we do that. And then there are a few collaborations that come through that I try to give to people in the lab that might be like a side project that they can make some progress on maybe quicker than their real research project, but they're trying to do biochemistry. And that idea is that someone will bring a sample and they can just look at it and do the structure biology part of it, which is still hard, but at least it's not doing the biochemistry. So we try to balance it that way.
Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to chime in.
I'm talking a lot. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess, like one of the important factors that comes into play in like a research group is that, yeah, you're there for the science, but if you don't have like that community in your research lab, then all the science can start to break down. So I guess, what are your kind of strategies for managing when you have situations in the lab where people aren't being productive because there's disagreements and arguments and that?
So that is really serious because that can take your lab down like super quick, and especially when you're starting your lab, you get one of these situations that goes south like this, and it can destroy your career, and it just also it makes it miserable to come to work. So I think one thing that you should do right now is pay attention in all the situations you are. Look at different labs, so you start to see styles and also see things. So one thing that I decided very early on in my career, because of experiences I had seen through my training, was that I did not want to be like a passive-aggressive PI. Because for me, I'd seen situations where, yeah, the PI just pretty much ignores everything until you can't ignore it anymore, and then at that point, it's almost unfixable. And it's not like, you can understand why someone might want to ignore it, because a lot of people don't like conflict, right? And it's really uncomfortable. I hate it myself. And so it's just easier to just like hope that it goes away. And it usually doesn't. So what I try to do, so my office is right next to the lab. And so I kind of can hear a little bit what's going on. That's the other thing, for most of you, you might not think your PI kind of knows what's going on. They kind of know what's going on in a general sense. So I can kind of keep an ear out for like dynamics that are happening in the lab. Not eavesdropping, but you just the general day-to-day stuff. I try not to get involved in like normal tiffs in the lab, because those also are always going to happen. You're always going to have arguments about who used the last of this and didn't order it, who left the gel, blah, 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 blah. I mean, those will happen every place you go, and they're never going to go away. So those kind of things you can deal with, but it's the more toxic stuff where there's a huge conflict. So then I usually will pull people into my office to discuss it individually, try to figure out what's going on, and then sometimes together, and then sometimes I will send them to like a mediator, like if it's really bad. So I had a really bad situation with a couple of my first graduate students. So I had a graduate student that came in and told me he couldn't stand the sound of someone else's voice in the lab if I could ask them to stop talking. That doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, that just doesn't work, right? Yeah, so, I mean, you're going to get all this weird stuff that happens to you. And so I was really at a loss of what to do about that. But luckily I had a mentor who I went and talked to, and she's like, it's your lab. So this is what when you start your lab, it's your lab. You set the tone, you make the rules. And so one rule was, you don't get to tell other people not to talk because you don't like their voice. But then I also talked to him about like what was going on. He's like, he can't concentrate because it was too noisy. And so we then instituted some time in the morning where there was no music playing, that everyone just kind of was supposed to chill and get their work done. And that seemed to work okay. I mean, it didn't really solve the problem until the student really graduated, and I moved that process faster as I could at that point. But yeah, you have to be willing to kind of get your hands dirty, I think, earlier rather than later. And then I also have a very open door policy where if I want people to solve their problems. You're all adults. I want people to talk to each other about their problems. But if there's a huge problem, I want to know about it, and then I will address it, because otherwise it just can turn into just a really bad situation. And the other thing, if you're in a lab that's happening, have some empathy for your PI, because there's a lot of things like you can't do. I mean, like there's nothing, I couldn't fix that problem where this person hated this other person's voice. I mean, what? So have some empathy, right? That especially if it looks like your PI is trying, they're probably trying really hard, but there are also limitations to what we can do. We can't just tell someone like, oh, that's just crazy, you're crazy. Like, well, you could, but that probably increases the problem. So yeah, have empathy for everyone in your lab trying to deal with that.
Yeah, I think kind of based off of that, so you said that you have 11 people in your lab.
Mm-hmm.
I came from a lab where I was one of 2 graduate students and a manager. How do you manage that many people? Is it because of the type of science you do that you have such large labs? Do you just like the dynamic of a larger lab?
Yeah, so 11 is about my limit. So I actually came here with 1 person, and it just kind of grew very quickly. And it's partly because we have a lot of success right now with our projects. So I have to say that those 11, a lot of them are senior, so they're more postdoc. So I have 3 graduate students, I think. Well, one's still in Vanderbilt, and then 2 in the lab. It's hard because I have a lot of honorary graduate students that I feel like they're mine, but they're not really mine. Like I don't have to, but they're still mine. So I meet with everyone once a week, where that's where I want to see all the stuff that's not working and working. And I wouldn't have 11 graduate students. So I think that would be too much for me, because graduate students, especially new graduate students, I think you need to be able to spend some time and make sure that they're doing okay. I actually really like my lab right now. It's great. But 6 or 7 is a good number for me. But 11 seems to be working, right guys? I mean, it seems to be working. But yeah, if you're an assistant professor, I would think like for most assistant professors, 11 would be a disaster. Yeah, and so if you're like looking to join, as a graduate student, looking to join an assistant professor who already has 11 people, you might think really carefully, because it just might be a little too thin on the ground with expertise.
So you talked a little bit about how to deal with interpersonal conflicts. What about with a student who is not succeeding in the lab?
Yeah, so that is really hard. That can be very hard. And so the way that has to be dealt with individual by individual, because it's unclear, sometimes it's unclear why. So the first thing that I usually do is if projects are not going well, we might narrow the project down a little bit. So this is also, I think, an assistant professor, usually, or at least it was an error for me. I would just be like, you get to work on the splices, and there's like nothing, that's a little too broad for a beginning student. We have all these ideas, and I think they just get so overwhelmed. And so I learned to you can start to just narrow things down. So my goal is always narrow things down till things start to work, and then you can move them up again, because it's really frustrating to not have anything work. And then we also talk about whether there might be another project that might fit their personality better or their interests better. And then I use their committee quite a bit. So if a student is really struggling, we usually will have more committee meetings, because the thesis committee can actually help provide some perspective of whether the experiments that we're trying to do are maybe just dumb and there might be something better to do, or they might they may be able to provide different type of advice that I just have not seen. I've never had to have a student move from my lab, but as a student, you should really consider that if things are not going well, for whatever reason, like really not going well, there's no shame in switching the lab. Sometimes that is the answer, and you're not really losing that much. You might think you're losing a lot of time, but if it's just not a good fit for whatever reason, you might actually gain time, because it's not like you've lost that experience that you have. You just need to find maybe a better home for you, so you should consider that too. Luckily, I've never gone through that.
When you end up managing all these people and you're not in the lab anymore,
Yes.
how do you keep in touch with the actual daily science and what's going on for real in the lab?
Yeah, so that's why the weekly meetings are very important, because that's where I want to see the raw data. And we also have a lot of, we have a weekly lab meeting where I want people to present like the raw data. I don't want to see the really nice presentation. I want to see the stuff. I want to see it. And then I mean, I'm not doing the science anymore. I help do some of the processing, but I'm not really like in the lab. But I am in the lab. I mean, like I get bored. So that's the other thing. A lot of times your PI will come out and you'll be like, why are they bothering me? It's because they're bored. They're sitting in their office, like writing a paper or doing this. They just want to like see some cool science. And so I'll come out and like I like to talk about that science there. And yeah, so, and then I also attend a lot of meetings and talk to a lot of colleagues to try to keep up on new techniques that I can bring back to help people with their projects. So I feel pretty connected to the science. I just don't physically do it anymore, even though I did set up a bench when I moved here, but it's now a rotation student bench because there's just not enough time. But an assistant professor, you want to do it. You're the best hands that you have, and that's just the way it is. And so if you want stuff to get done, you should definitely you need to carve out time to do the science, because you are going to be the person that drives those first projects forward. And so that's a transition that you start, and then, you know, as your lab grows and you get more funding and you start to have to do more service, that transition usually happens. Not always. Some people really fight to stay at the bench. But for me, you know, doing cryo-EM actually doing the imaging takes a lot of time. And I mean, I now run a lab and I have a family, and my time is best spent doing other things. But every paper that comes out is your name. And so you want to know what the data is.
Any other questions?
I got a follow-up on that question is this transition when you were assistant professor from the bench, when you were still doing the experiments, to more withdrawn. Was it natural and you didn't really think about it? Was it a conscious?
No, it was more natural because you get more people trained in your lab. You start to get asked, so your first year, your department should be really protecting you from any sort of other stuff that you have to do. And then that quickly goes away. And so then you have like all these meetings that are happening, so it gets harder and harder. And then for me, the final kind of, the last straw as I had my second child, and when that was like where it was no longer possible for me to like spend all night taking images. This was before we could do automation, so you'd actually have to sit at the microscope all night and do it. I mean, I couldn't do it anymore, and so that was kind of the last of me doing research in the lab. But I still process stuff at home, and the stuff that I can do both at the office and at home, I still do a lot of. And write. Oh my God, I write a lot.
Any other questions from the audience?
What's your opinion on who to hire first when you're starting up your new lab, whether that be like technical staff first and then students or postdocs?
Right, so this, yeah, you'll get like a million different answers so from everyone you ask. So for me, the most important hire, and this is what I would tell everyone in my lab, a competent technician. because they are going to be the person, your right-hand person, who helps you get your work done. And if they're confident, they're also going to help train other people in your lab. Because it takes a lot of time to train new people. And so for me, that was my first hire. And I hired someone who had a master's degree. So it was expensive, but you have a startup for a reason. So your startup you have to be careful with, but if you're too careful with, you won't get any more money. So it's there to spend, and so decide how you're going to spend it. And for me, hiring someone who could help. For most people, you're not going to get really strong postdocs when you start. You might get lucky, and if you do, snap them up. But for the most part, you're going to be relying on a really good lab technician and graduate students. And those are going to be, for the most part, your first hires. And so the other thing that a really good lab manager can do that will save you so much time is all of the regulations you have to do, all of the safety forms, the inspections, the different bureaucracy of how to turn in ordering things. I mean, I don't think you have time to really do that as a new professor. I mean, some people do it. See, you'll get all sorts of answers. But for me, I did not want to deal with any of that. And so the person I hired did that. And so that was a huge bonus for me. So I would do that again. That was like my best decision ever. I had a lot of bad ones, but that was the good decision. But I also had when I started my lab, I had an 8-week-old. So, I mean, it was just insane. So I just did not have time to do all the bureaucracy stuff.
On the flip side of kind of dealing with breakdowns in the lab is how do you kind of actively build a good lab culture and kind of have a good community where everybody's happy to work together and that kind of thing.
Right. So that's really important to me, and so I make it very clear, we have state of the union lab discussions once a year or so. I make it very clear that I expect people to work together. They don't have to be best friends. We do social things. We have a couple lab parties each year, and then I also very specifically try to step away from some of the social things in the lab, because I think a PI, so the lab needs to be able to go out and complain about the PI, and they can't do that if you're there. So, and so I like it when the lab does stuff on their own without me being involved in it, and I think that's really healthy. And there are other PIs that really do like to hang out. I mean, I would like to hang out, but I have to go home to my kids, and so it's better for them to go do it themselves. And also, yeah, I mean, we all know that, I mean, I did it to my PIs too. I like to complain about them, and so you need to do that without your PI around, because it would hurt my feelings, actually. So rather than do it if I don't listen to them do it. So I encourage them to go do stuff on their own. So I don't want to be too involved. And that can be a trap you can fall in as an assistant professor, is that you're closer to age. So, and you're used to being in that lab, you're used to feeling the camaraderie, but you're not anymore, you're the boss. So you have to figure out how you're going to deal with that divide. And everyone deals with it differently, but there is a divide there, even if you don't want to, even if you pretend there's not, there's a divide.
Actually, so the other day I was complaining about something in lab, as usual. And so I was talking to one of my friends about how, I don't know, we do things differently or see things differently. And so we were discussing on whether it's good to have people in the lab that are all sort of similar, or whether it's better to have a balance. So how do you navigate that when hiring, so that not everyone that comes into the lab, is sort of exactly the same or sees things the same way?
Yeah, it usually happens pretty organically, I think. It's not like you get, at least for me, it's not like there's there's not 40 people wanting to join my lab, so it's not like I get to really choose. It's, people come, yeah, I've never really worried too much about that. I'm mostly worried that it's someone a team player, because I want people that actually get along. I don't care if people are friends. I understand you're not always friends with people in your lab. I mean, I really understand that because I've experienced that. But I want everyone to be able to get along. And so I do ask opinions when people interview. The lab's opinion means a lot to me. So if everyone in the lab is like, we don't like this person, or we don't think they'll fit, I will not hire them, even if I think that they are very good scientifically, because it's not worth it for me to have that kind of conflict. And I have been in places where I've seen people just hire people even when the lab is like, we don't like this person, and then that usually turns out really bad. So that's how I kind of deal with it. And I expect my people to be open-minded enough to be able to recognize that they may not have the same style.
Did you find yourself in a situation in which you had to let a person go? That person was not a good fit, and how do you deal with that? To acknowledge by that person, you cannot just let them go one day.
Yeah. So this is
the
the most horrible part of it.
Yeah.
And I'll say I am not any better at hiring people than I was when I started, but I am better at figuring out it's not working, like in a quicker way, and taking care of the problem. So let's say, okay, so first of all, my first really big piece of advice and I would say even if someone tells you not to listen to the advice, you'd be foolish to not listen to this advice. This is good advice. When you start your lab, you're going to have a lot of people coming and asking you for jobs, and a lot of these people are going to be internal hires, okay? They might be a great fit, but you need to really figure out why they're an internal hire, okay? Sometimes a lab has moved and they couldn't move because of family reasons. Okay, that's fine. But there are other cases where people they don't like firing people, and so they kind of move them to another lab. And it might work, but as an assistant professor, that usually doesn't. And so the other thing that happens when you do that is that you don't have, usually institutions have some window where it's pretty easy to let someone go, like a 6 month, usually it's around 6 months. But if you hire internally, you don't have that window, okay? So you've already lost that. So then what you have to do is if you hire someone new, the first 6 months, you have to pay really super attention. And like my criteria is, like are experiments working? So this is another thing that I really struggled with is you hire someone and it's not working. Now a student's different because you're taking them to train, but like a staff member, you hire them to do a job and it's not working and you think, it's me. I'm not being a good manager. I'm not giving them the right project. It's not working. Don't go down that rabbit hole too far because it's probably not you. It may be you, but it doesn't matter because you are the one running the lab. So if it's not working in that 6 months, you document. Start documenting immediately. You just keep a piece of paper, and every time you meet, you just write just a couple sentences of what you talked about and what is expected the next meeting. So it just creates this really, it shouldn't take more than 2 or 3 minutes. And then you just have this record of meeting and you have to be very clear about what you want. You can't just be like, you want to be like, next week I want to see this gel. And it has to be reasonable. Of course it has to be reasonable, but we need to see this gel, so you just make it very clear. And I did not do this when I began because you just don't know. And then if you do that and it's not working out, then you can go to HR and say, okay, we have a problem. And then they'll help you work out how the process goes. But it's a long process. So if you can do it in the 6 months where you can pretty much say it's not working, go away, that is the best. And then I always feel horrible. And I think there's no way around that. Well, there might be. If you might be a person and more power to you if you don't feel too bad. I usually feel really bad. But it's just like ripping a Band-Aid off. It's in the end, it's your career. So you cannot afford to pay someone who is not producing the data that you need. And they're probably miserable too. And there may be something else that they would rather do. But for you, it's like self-preservation. The most money you will spend, unless you're doing mouse work or cryo-EM, then you'll spend a lot on microscopes and mice, but is the personnel. Your personnel cost is the most. And so if you have someone who's not producing, you're not a charity. You cannot let them sit there. So that's the pep talk I still have to give myself. It's like, I have to do something. But it's really uncomfortable. But lean on your HR people.
Do you give them heads up? Do you like
talk to your HR person to find the protocol, because there are like protocols for this. And yeah, you do have to give them heads up. And usually they'll catch on because, and you know, at some level then you'll start to have to be like, you'll have to really document the conversations. You'll have to have them maybe sign things that say what needs to be done. It's really hard. It's hard mentally to fire someone, but it's also hard, just bureaucracy hard. So you have to be careful in that. And I mean, you just know, you never know, even if you think someone's going to be a good fit, you're never quite sure. And I don't think I'm any better at that than when I started, unfortunately.
Any other questions?
There's a question back there.
So I had a question, which is the same that she asked, but I have another. So I'm wondering how you navigate like having members of your lab kind of work together on one project, or if there's a certain technique that one lab member is really good at and another lab member can benefit from that. Yes, how do you, or if you need something quickly for a grant, like who do you ask for these things that aren't necessarily part of someone's real project, but they still need to be done?
That's right. So and you have to be really careful about that, because you don't want to, like, you don't want to derail someone's ability to do their own project. So I really encourage a lot of collaboration in the lab, and I kind of have a philosophy that we do the science and it all shakes out in the end. Now this can go very bad. It can go very bad. So the way that we keep it from going really bad is that we don't talk about, so if someone's helping someone's project, anybody who really helps goes on a paper, full stop. We don't talk about, and if you're helping someone's main project, you do that with the idea that you are not going to be the first author. But we don't get into the whole like who is where on the authorship list until it's much closer, and then we have discussions. And these are also tough, can be tough discussions, but it has to happen. As a PI, you have, at least I feel like you have to, this is the not being passive aggressive. This is, you have to talk about it and try to come up with a plan, and it should be driven by your ethics. You know, it should not be driven by, So, I mean, just as an example, so we are trying to get a paper ready, and my postdoc has done a lot of work on this paper. It's his project. I've done a lot of work on this paper. Our collaborator has done a lot of work on this paper, and then we ended up having to bring in some collaborators to help us build a model, because that's not something that we can do very quickly. Well, it turned out to be a lot of work. And so I had to go to my postdoc and say, okay, these people, we could not have done this project without these people. So I think this person deserves to be a co-first author. You'll still be listed first, but this needs to be co-first author. And I believe this so strongly that I also think that we need to make the crystallographer PI a co-corresponding author. So I'm not just asking you to give, it's not really giving something up, but you just have this feeling of like, oh, I don't want to do that. But so we have these conversations, and we just make it so, yeah, I mean, if this is what it takes to get it done, this is what we do. And the idea that we'll grow the pie bigger and not shrink it smaller. So if everyone's helping, more papers will come out, more papers for everybody. But it can can be a tricky area. But I don't want people afraid to help each other in the lab, and that also really slows things down. And I refuse to have people in the lab who are actively working against each other. And I have seen that happen at other institutions. And that, I mean, if you feel like you have to lock up your lab notebook because you have a lab member who is going to go and steal your ideas, that would be a reason I would fire someone immediately.
Kind of a follow-up to the question about kind of authorship and that sort of thing. So if you have, your postdoc, and you've got these collaborators coming in, and they're doing a lot of great work, and then you have a grad student that's helped out here and there, and they're kind of along for the ride, and they're there for learning, are they automatically authors because they put their foot in the door once or twice, or?
No, it has to be a real contribution. And yeah, it has to be a real contribution. But I think it can be a little gray. So the biggest mistake I have ever made in my entire career is not including someone on a paper that I should have. With the idea that, I don't know what my idea was. I was not thinking clearly. Because, you get so caught up in the fact that, oh, I don't want any more people on my paper. Well, it doesn't make a difference. And it doesn't really make a difference. And in this case, I left someone off that I should have included. And it could have really destroyed a very important colleague, the way that I get along with my colleagues. And I ended up having to really apologize, and I'm actually very embarrassed by this. And so my advice to you is always try to be more inclusive in authorship than less, because if you bring people on good feelings, you leave someone off that should be on really bad feelings. I mean, just think how horrible you would feel if someone just like totally diminished what your major contributions are. And so that would be my big piece of advice. But at the same time, when I have rotation students come in and like they're helping, I say up front, for a rotation project, for the most part, you're helping, you have kind of a project that's being almost given to you. That does not mean you're going to have authorship necessarily on it.
That's more of an acknowledgement.
That's more of an acknowledgement because, a graduate student or postdoc's really taking their time to bring them onto a project, maybe even slowing down their project. I mean, truthfully, right? When you work with someone. So that's kind of a policy. I don't have a policy that anybody who touches something gets on the paper. But if they really do contribute, we put them on.
So we have like 5 minutes. So this might be a good question to end on. So what advice would you give yourself if you could go back in time when you just started your lab?
Yeah, I hardly remember when I first started my lab because I was so tired because of I had a newborn. I think you should be kind to gentle with yourself. Don't expect perfection. I mean, just understand that things are going to go really wrong. I mean, things are going to go really well, but there's things that are just going to go wrong. And just expect that. And it's not because you've made a mistake. It's just life. We all know scientists are quirky people. Your PIs are quirky. The people in your lab have their quirks. And it's a weird business because it's a job, but at the same time, it's kind of a family. It's this weird mixture. And so things are going to go weird. So just accept that. And then really find good mentors. And I'm not talking about the mentors that they give you, because every university now will give you pretty much a mentorship committee. And they can be very helpful, but go beyond that and find someone you can really go and talk to about these kind of issues. And don't be afraid to go ask for help. Because you'll get advice about, oh yeah, that's really weird, you shouldn't put up with that. Or, that's kind of normal, maybe you should just chill out a little bit. You can get that advice from senior people that can really help you not burn bridges.
Do we have any last questions?
So along the same lines of that question, going back to when you first started your lab, there was one skill that you wish you had more training on. What would it be?
Not much. So when we were in graduate school and even as postdocs, we never had any of this kind of discussion. And I think this kind of discussion is really good, but I guess being able to write quickly. If you can learn to write quickly, that will save you a lot of headache. So I would say, you're gonna have to manage people and you're not really used to that, but you can't really get trained for that, I don't think. I think it's just an intrinsic thing. But learning how to write quickly without having to have like 4 or 5 hours to sit down and do something, that is a skill that will really help you as an assistant professor, because you'll have these like little chunks of time, and if you can't use them, then you're really going to fall behind.
So any last questions? I think we're wrapping up here. Nope. All right, thank you so much for joining us.